Hi, everyone. I'm Belle Philibosian with the USGS Earthquake Science Center. How can I advance the slide? You'll do it. Okay. Yeah. So our offices are in Moffett Field down in Mountain View, not too far from where we are here in East Palo Alto. So I'm going to talk briefly today about earthquakes and their associated hazards, and specifically how they affect East Palo Alto. Next slide, please. So I'm sure everyone knows this, but it's worth reviewing. An earthquake is the sudden shaking of the earth that occurs because of sudden slip along a fault. So to know the hazards from earthquakes, we need to know where the faults are and how large the earthquakes they are likely to produce. So here are a couple of historical photos of from the San Andreas earthquake in 1906 that caused offset of this fence, and also this road, which is now Highway 92, that some of you may recognize. Next slide, please. So the last major Bay Area earthquake, which I'm sure many here remember, was the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989. That actually had an epicenter way down south near Santa Cruz, but much of the damage was concentrated 60 miles north of that in San Francisco and Oakland. And that was because of vulnerable land in those areas. The bay mud that many structures, such as the Cypress Viaduct, were built on, amplified the shaking and in some cases liquefied. So earthquakes like this are inevitable, but these disastrous consequences are not. Earthquake science gives us information we need to build resilient societies. Next slide, please. So this is an overview of the earthquake hazards in the San Francisco Bay region, and this is one of the flyers that I have in the back for that those in the room can collect later. So each of the numbers on this map represents a probability of earthquakes occurring on that fault line in the time period between 2014 and 2043. So you can see that there are some major players on this map, include the San Andreas Fault, that has earthquakes every 150 to 250 years, and the last one was in 1906. So that, if you crunch the numbers there, it's unlikely, but not impossible, to have a large rupture soon. On the other side of the bay, we have the Hayward Fault that you've probably heard about. That actually has earthquakes a little bit more frequently, with an average of about 150 years. And the last rupture there was in 1868. So if you do that math, it's quite likely to have a large earthquake soon. However, because there is variability, it could also be decades before the next large Hayward Fault earthquake. Next slide, please. There are also numerous other less active faults on this map. Those are all the yellow lines that you can see. Each of these individual faults probably has earthquakes every several hundred or several thousand years, but there are a lot of these faults. So taken collectively, earthquakes would occur on one of these less active faults. There's a 13% chance within 30 years of a large earthquake on somewhere on one of these faults. So there's a substantial hazard from these lesser known faults. And next slide, the South Napa earthquake in 2014 is a perfect example of this. So that was a magnitude 6 on one of these little studied faults, but pretty significant damage. Next slide, please. So to add all this together, there's a 72% chance of an earthquake above magnitude 7 somewhere in this region before 2043. So that's pretty likely. Next, please. So I will briefly go through the hazards that we face from these earthquakes and how they affect East Palo Alto specifically. So first of all, there's the hazard from shaking. Next slide. So basically, there are so many faults in the Bay Area that anywhere you look would have a likely within 50 years. So let's say 50% chance within 50 years of very strong shaking. We call that intensity 7 on this color scale that you may have seen. There are many different models and they have slight differences between them. I'm showing this model to highlight the effect of that sediment or bay mud, which is amplifying the shaking. The closer you get to the bay, basically, the more amplification you would see from that. And that could potentially push things into the severe to violent shaking. Next slide, please. Yes. So then we have fault displacement. So in this picture, again, you can see this fence has been snapped off, and maybe that's not such a big deal if it's a fence, but if you have a structure on top of that, or perhaps a pipeline buried beneath that, that's going to be a problem. So next slide, please. In East Palo Alto, that's probably not a significant risk because there are a few faults. You can see on this map, the San Jose fault labeled there passes through East Palo Alto, but these are not very active faults. Certainly nothing in comparison to the San Andreas or Hayward fault. So the likelihood of fault displacement within East Palo Alto is low. However, there could be offsets on the Hayward fault or the San Andreas fault might sever lifelines such as gas pipelines that would have an effect. Next slide, please. Continue. Okay, so that brings us to liquefaction. So what is liquefaction? That is when you have a sediment that is saturated with water that essentially liquefies during earthquake shaking. It turns to soup, and that can cause heavy objects on top to sink into it. So this is showing a car and also some buildings. These buildings didn't sustain much damage from the shaking itself, but essentially tilted and sank into the mud because it liquefied during shaking. And that is a significant risk in East Palo Alto. If we can have the next slide, please. So basically you can, and there's a link to this map at the end, so you can go look it up, but essentially all around the bay, there are moderate to high risks of liquefaction due to the saturated or potentially saturated sediments that exist close to the bay and in East Palo Alto in particular. Next slide, please. Landsliding. Sorry, that was too many slides. Landsliding, good news for East Palo Alto because there's no slopes and you would need a significant slope for landsliding to occur. So that's not something we need to worry about here. However, tsunamis are a potential minor risk. Next slide, please. So essentially the entire California coast has a risk from tsunamis from either local earthquakes or potentially earthquakes much farther away, such as Alaska or Japan. However, being on the coast within San Francisco Bay does decrease that risk because the tsunami amplitudes would be decreased being in the bay. It's somewhat sheltered. So this is a tsunami hazard zone map for East Palo Alto, and you can see that essentially this is not a USGS product. This is NOAA actually is the one that does tsunamis, but as you can see, the tsunami hazard areas are largely the park or salt pond areas, not really the developed areas. So the concern would be getting a tsunami alert to people who might be in those areas. And again, those alerts are managed by NOAA, not USGS. Next slide, please. So I will only briefly go through the earthquake preparation because I understand some other people are going to focus on that. But earthquakes are going to keep happening, but we can reduce damage and losses by taking appropriate preparations and actions. Next slide, please. So the big thing, the most important thing to do is to retrofit or build good buildings that are going to be resistant to earthquakes. There's a common phrase that we say, which is that earthquakes don't kill people, buildings do. If you're outside and far away from any buildings, you will be fine in an earthquake, basically no matter how large. So those are building codes, zoning to not build buildings right on top of an active fault, for example, and then retrofitting buildings that already exist. Next slide, please. We also have earthquake early warnings. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. Next slide, please. Tsunami warnings are also, again, managed by NOAA. Next slide, please. And then there's, of course, personal and municipal emergency preparation. And I'll point people to the wonderful steps to earthquake safety at earthquakecountry.org. And there's also flyers in the back. Next slide, please. So many of these materials are geared toward personal preparation, but I think anyone here can think about how the city could facilitate people in making these kinds of preparations. And I'm not going to go through all these details here, but I like to emphasize that there's a lot of information, there's a lot of preparation that you can do, and it's easy for that to become overwhelming. So I think it's important to emphasize that doing Something is better than doing nothing. You shouldn't worry if you can't do everything on this list. If you can do just one thing, try to focus on the most important thing, the most impactful thing. So just as an example, at the top there, number one is securing your space. Focus on areas where you spend the most time. Your desk, your bed. Is there something heavy that's going to fall onto it? Secure that, and you've gotten 90% of the way there. I think I probably don't have much more time, so if we can just advance through the details of these slides, you can read this in the other materials. Water is a super high priority for emergency supplies, and I saw in the report associated with this meeting that there's a lot of focus on water supplies, and that's great. That is absolutely the right thing to do. Yes, so during an earthquake, again, think about where you spend most of your time. What are you going to do if you're in bed? Next slide, please. If you're in bed, turn face down, protect your head and neck with a pillow. Don't jump and get out of bed. It's better to stay in bed. Next, if you're outside, stay outside and away from buildings. Next, if you're inside, stay inside, don't run outside, and drop, cover, and hold on. So that is get it under a sturdy table or a desk to protect yourself from falling objects. And there's modifications to that if you have limited mobility, for example, and there's more details you can find both on the flyers and on those websites. Next slide, please. So I'll just briefly talk about Shake Alert, Earthquake Early Warning. So Shake Alert is a USGS service that detects earthquakes very quickly and then sends an alert that can reach many people before shaking arrives. And those alerts are delivered to both automated systems such as trains and public address systems and to mobile phones. With the mobile phones, there's a variety of ways that you can get the alerts, either through WIA or different apps or the Android operating system. Next slide, please. So based on the method of delivery of the alert, there's a magnitude threshold. So that is an earthquake has to reach a certain magnitude before an alert is sent out. And then once an alert is sent out, it's sent to the phones or devices that are within an area that's expected to see a certain intensity of shaking. So you may have gotten some of these recently in the last few years. And I just wanted to provide that background on how it works. So we can continue to the final slide, which has a bunch of online resources for all of the things that I talked about. Faults map, recent earthquakes, liquefaction, Shake Alert, earthquake preparedness info, all of that stuff is in here. And I would be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much for the informative presentation. I guess one of the reasons why you're here is to present us with new information. And I was aware of some of this, but I was unaware that there's a San Jose fault going through East Palo Alto. Could you speak more of that? I mean, it seems like even if it's not going to do a lot of regional damage, if we have let's say a 6.0 shaking in East Palo Alto, that could be a tremendous damage. And I guess also with aftershocks, is this the sort of thing where like maybe there's a huge earthquake and then this one